So we're going to go through 1 week's worth of lab materials in this PowerPoint, and the very first thing that we're going to cover is the cross-section of the nerve. So this is a cross-section of a nerve at a fairly low magnification. There are some structures you can see and others that you can't. The really tiny circles all the way through here are basically axons that are surrounded by a myelin sheath. But you can't really distinguish between those because the magnification isn't high enough. Don't worry, we'll get there. So at this scale, here are the things that I would like you to see. First of all, this is the epineurium. That's that very thickest connective tissue layer that runs around an entire nerve. This is the perineurium, which we'll see it a little bit better with a closer magnification. This entire thing is a fascicle. And you've got adipose tissue right here. So you can get a sort of a sense for the scale of this now. Zooming in slightly further, these are the neuron axons that are surrounded by endoneurium. So again, we'll see these in more detail on the next slide. Here's the epineurium again. This is the perineurium. So now you get a better idea of exactly which layer that is. So this is a nerve fascicle at high power. So here you have the nerve cell axon. That's that spot that's right at the middle there. Surrounding it is the myelin sheath. Now that's the white area. The darker area that's around that is going to be the endoneurium. So that's all of the structures that I want you to know from the cross-section of a nerve. Next up, we've got a neuron smear. And in this neuron smear, there are a number of things that I want you to see with this. First of all, this is the neuron cell body. Within the neuron cell body, you've got the nucleus, and within the nucleus, you've got one or more nucleoli. So there's a nucleolus. Finally, here's the cytoplasmic extension and a neuroglial cell. So all of these smaller dark dots that are surrounding the neuron are actually neuroglial cells. Then the next thing we're going to look at is a cerebrum cell. We're going to start this slide by looking at gray matter. So the gray matter of the cerebellum is composed of 3 different layers. The innermost layer is the granular layer. Superficial to that is the Purkinje cell layer, and we'll take a closer look at these cells in the next slide. Superficial to that is the molecular layer. Now deep to the granular layer, you're going to have the white matter, which in the cerebellum is going to be called the arbor vitae. As with the cerebrum, the cerebellum is divided into folds and depressions. So the depressions are referred to as sulci, sulcus, singular, and the folds are referred to as gyri, or in the singular, gyrus. This is a more close-up look at the Purkinje cell layer, and so you can see 3 Purkinje cells here. So these are large neurons, and the arrows pointing towards the lowermost one. The next thing we're going to look at is a section of the cerebrum. So the cerebrum has a superficial cortex made up of gray matter. White matter is deep to that. It's not called the arbor vitae this time, though. It's just called white matter. This is a gyrus, and this is a sulcus. If we take a closer look at the cortex, we're going to see pyramidal cells. Okay, the next thing we're going to take a look at is a lot of different structures on the sheep brain. So we're kind of following your handout from top to bottom. So this is a look at the whole sheep brain. So we're going to take a look at structures on this one. So this is the cerebellum. This is the spinal cord. Here's a gyrus. This is a sulcus, so you can see folds and depressions. This is the longitudinal fissure, which divides the 2 cerebral hemispheres. These are the 2 cerebral hemispheres. And this is the occipital lobe. This is the parietal lobe. And this is the frontal lobe. The temporal lobes, we don't have a really good view of these at this angle. So taking a look at the underside of the brain, you can see a number of different structures. This is the optic nerve. The temporal lobe, now we get a view of that. The medulla oblongata, the pons, the spinal cord, the pituitary gland, also called the hypophysis, and the optic chiasma. We also have the olfactory bulbs here to the very right. Here's another look at the underside of the sheep brain. These are the olfactory tracts. Here's the temporal lobe again. This is the mammillary body. This is part of the midbrain. This is the dura mater. This is the spinal cord. This is the pituitary gland. The pia mater, which is a very thin layer, it's the innermost of the meninges, and it's kind of hard to distinguish on the sheep brain unless you're right there, maybe with the pair of tweezers. This is the optic chiasma. It's where the two optic nerves cross. And this is the olfactory bulb. Another look at the ventral view. This is the dura mater, the tough outermost layer, the tough outermost meninx. This is the mammillary body. This is the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, the pons. This is the trigeminal nerve, which is one of the 12 cranial nerves. So this is a look at the dorsal midbrain, and what the person here has done is to pull the cerebrum up and away from the brainstem. So looking at some of the labeled things here, this is the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the pineal body, which is actually technically part of the diencephalon. It is sometimes called part of the epithalamus. This is the superior colliculus of the corpora quadrigemina. So the corpora quadrigemina are sort of four swellings. Here's the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus, and they're responsible for reflexive head turning in response to either sudden visual or auditory stimuli. And this is the cerebellum. Looking at a mid-sagittal section of the sheep brain, here's the arbor vitae. This is the white matter of the cerebellum. Here's the cerebral hemisphere, and the arrow is actually in the cerebral cortex, but you can see the white matter deep to that. This is the dura mater, so you get an idea of how thick the outermost meninx is. This is the corpus callosum, so this is white matter, and the corpus callosum actually serves as a connection between the two cerebral hemispheres. This is the cross-section of the optic chiasma. This is the pituitary gland, which is the master gland of the endocrine system. This is the thalamus. Taking a look at the lateral view of this section of sheep brain, here's the cerebral hemisphere. This is the cerebellum. Here's the spinal cord. Here's the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the olfactory bulb. Taking another look at this mid-sagittal section, we have the central canal. So this is the canal that actually runs down the spinal cord and contains cerebrospinal fluid. This is the cerebellum. Here's the pineal gland or body. This is the third ventricle. This is one of the fluid-filled spaces of the brain. This is the corpus callosum. This is the thalamus. Here's the pons. And here's the medulla oblongata. Finally, we end with the spinal cord. Here's another look at the mid-sagittal section of the sheep brain. So once again, the spinal cord. The cerebral aqueduct. This is actually a canal between the third and the fourth ventricle containing cerebrospinal fluid. Here's the thalamus, the corpus callosum, the optic chiasma, the pituitary gland, and the pons, and finally we end with the medulla oblongata. Finally we end with the central canal. Okay, here's a closer look at the mid-sagittal section. So you can see the corpora quadrigemina here. Here again is the cerebral aqueduct. This is the fourth ventricle, so this is one of the fluid-filled spaces of the brain, and it lies in humans just posterior to the cerebellum. This is the cerebral peduncle. Taking a look at this view of the mid-sagittal section, the corpora quadrigemina are composed of the superior and the inferior colliculus. Here's the pineal gland. the third ventricle, the fornix, and now we come to a spinal cord cross-section. So in the spinal cord cross-section, we have the central canal. This outline is of the gray matter. So there are a number of features that you can see of the gray matter in a spinal cord cross-section. This is the dorsal or posterior horn. This is the ventral or anterior horn. And connecting the two hemispheres, you have the gray commissure. This is white matter. This is the anterior median fissure, sometimes called the anterior median sulcus. This is the posterior median fissure, sometimes called the posterior median sulcus. And this is the dura mater. If we take a closer look at the cross-section of the spinal cord at high power, there are a number of things that we can see. First of all, this is part of the ventral or anterior horn. This is white matter, so you may be able to make out individual axons with myelin surrounding them. This is the anterior median fissure. This is the pia mater. This is the dura mater. You can see the difference in thickness between those two. This is adipose tissue. And finally, this is a blood vessel. All right, finally, we're going to end up with the nerve plexuses. So now we're going to take a look at the plexuses of the spinal cord. And we saw earlier in an earlier slide how nerves are divided into smaller bundles called fascicles. And so what this means is that fascicles can split off from one nerve and join another. And because of this, you're going to see some real tangles in the spinal nerves that come off of the spinal cord. These tangles are called plexuses. You generally see these associated with the limbs. So you're going to see the cervical and the brachial plexus associated with the musculature of the neck and the arm. You're going to see the lumbar and sacral plexus associated with the musculature of the legs. And additionally, keep in mind that there's a lot of nerve endings out at the ends of our fingers and the tips of our toes. And so because of that, you're going to have an increased sensory input as opposed to maybe one of the ribs and the skin covering the ribs and the intercostal muscles. So the greater complexity in terms of muscles and of senses in the limbs sort of yields itself to a more complicated nervous system architecture. So we'll take a look at these. So this is the cervical plexus, and if we zoom in on it a little bit more, we'll see that the cervical plexus actually comes out of spinal nerves C1 through C5. So if you look at the sort of looped portion of this, this is a portion of the cervical plexus called the ansa cervicalis. And you can see that it gets contributions from C1, C2, and C3. So this is what I meant by these things becoming quite the tangle. Next, we're going to take a look at the brachial plexus. So the brachial plexus, as you can see in the blow-up, actually arises from C5 through T1. Now, I realize that the cervical plexus also arises from C5, but this means that the spinal nerves can actually contribute to more than one plexus, and this is what you see happening with the C5 spinal nerve. Okay, third, we've got the lumbar plexus, and if we take a closer look at the lumbar plexus, we can see that it goes from spinal nerve T12 down to L5. Beneath that, we've got the sacral plexus, and the sacral plexus has contributions from L4, L5, and the first 4 sacral nerves. And so again, you can see that it's possible for a spinal nerve to make a contribution to more than one plexus. So this is what you can see here.